Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we talk about Holocaust remembrance and the lessons we can learn from it for speaking up against anti-Semitism today. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in a documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Dimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeOfTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwest in a town in Elgin, Illinois, where all the Jews at our one synagogue did not have a connection to the Holocaust. Their parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. Yet, in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Mark Weitzman is Chief Operating Officer for the World Jewish Restitution Organization. He plays a leading role in advocacy and negotiation efforts to recover Jewish properties in Europe in pursuit of a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors, their families, and Jewish communities. He's also a member of the official US delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, or IHRA, where he chaired the Committee on Antisemitism and Holocaust Denial. He is also the past chair of the Working Group on Holocaust Museums and Memorials. He's also the vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. Mark, welcome. We're honored to have you on our show.
Thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be here with you.
Thank you. So, can you tell us a little about your background? What brought you to the important work you're doing?
Well, it's actually interesting in some ways, to me at least, because I'm not a child of survivors at all. My four grandparents and even a couple of my great-grandparents were here in the U.S. Way before World War II. I did not grow up with the Holocaust as a primary interest or focus in my family. However, I did grow up. I was born in Brooklyn and grew up in a modern Orthodox home and schooling in a non-Jewish neighborhood. And I think something there raised the question, which I've never really moved away from, of the relationship between Jews and non-Jews and the outside world around them. And when I was going through graduate school, my interests were Jewish intellectual history, as well as that relationship between Jews and non-Jews, which focused not necessarily on on the Holocaust, but more on the history of anti-Semitism and Jewish-Christian relations. Nonetheless, at some point during that period, when I was offered a position with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I realized that was a chance to translate an academic interest, intellectual interest, into practical work, keep a foot sort of in both the academic and the practical world. Took it and spent 35 or so years working at the Wiesenthal Center as Director of Government Affairs there, and directing some of the research for the Wiesenthal Center, and then shifted to WJRO a year ago, kind of in fulfillment of what one of my mentors, Simon Wiesenthal, blessed memory, he always used to talk about, that he wasn't going to, if he got to heaven, he was being judged, it wasn't going to be as necessarily a Nazi hunter per se, or any of the things that people associated with him, but it was in keeping alive the memory of what happened for the survivors and achieving justice for them. And in some ways, the opportunity to come full circle and bring some closure or some measure of justice to survivors before time ran out brought me back here. And it's a chance to combine elements of both my previous worlds and current, because there are issues such as distortion of the Holocaust, which are clearly both anti-Semitic in many ways, as well have an impact in the world of restitution. So that brings me here to where we sit today.
Okay. So
a remarkable cause that you are, dedicating yourself to. Thank you for that.
Since our podcast is mostly on anti-Semitism, and though we frequently talk about the Holocaust. Let's first talk about your work at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. Tell us about drafting the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, how it's been adopted around the world by some institutions in some countries, and why that's important.
Well, to begin with that, answering that, I have to actually answer a couple of other questions that were sort of unasked here before I get to that definition. So first of all, to explain what IHRA is to our listeners who may not be aware of it. IHRA is an intergovernmental organization, which means that it has some sort of official status. To join IHRA, countries, and it's only national nations that can join IHRA, not individuals or organizations per se. Excuse me. Have to have an application from the foreign minister or that level of interest, and the delegations are headed by senior diplomats, ambassadors, or those envoys on that level. The delegations are composed of experts in academia, in education, in museums, memorials, and so on, who come together twice a year to work. The chair rotates every year. It's a different country. Currently, it's Sweden. But IHRA's goals are to increase education and remembrance about the Holocaust. It is not legally binding. In other words, an IHRA decision is a political or a moral decision, but it's not legally binding on countries. But it has certainly an impact because of the governmental participation in it, the formality of it. The tricky and hard part of IHRA is that all decisions are taken by consensus, meaning in that case that every country around the table has to assent, has to agree to the decision, otherwise it's blocked. So to get something through IHRA, you have to have, at this point, 35 countries agreeing to something. The membership of IHRA is both European, in many ways the countries, Western and Eastern, the countries that were involved in the Holocaust in different ways, from Germany to France to the UK, to Serbia, Croatia, the Balkans, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, so on and so forth, as well as countries like Israel, the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia. So it truly is multinational, global in many ways, and it has become the go-to sort of organization for official Holocaust remembrance, and now including anti-Semitism. So a number of years ago, we were realized that when I was chairing this committee and involved in this committee on anti-Semitism, that the issue of Holocaust distortion and denial was beginning to percolate even more so. And we were sitting around the table, representatives of 35 countries, various disciplines, and we had to be sure that everybody was speaking the same language, meaning, our common language is English, but first of all, not everyone's English is perfect. And secondly, that there's a lot of gray areas and nuance when it comes to talking about these subjects, that we want to be sure that everyone understood exactly what we were referring to. So we drafted initially a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, where I was the lead author of, which was finally adopted in 2013 under the Canadian chairmanship. Having successfully passed that, and that took about 5 years to get through because there were a number of countries. The denial issue was not difficult. Everyone agreed after Deborah Lipstadt's famous trial and victory against David Irving, that everyone agreed that the neo-Nazi version of Holocaust denial was, okay, we could agree, that's bad. But when it came to distortion, which involved, for example, attempts to whitewash local collaborators, or to lessen the number of victims, or to exaggerate the number of rescuers, or any of those sort of gray kind of areas that did not reach into outright Holocaust denial, there were countries that were hesitant to embrace that. And it took some political effort and will power and maneuvering and hard work to get it finally adopted. Having succeeded in that, and I want to mention, by the way, the person who's most responsible for the founding of IHRA is the great historical Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer. And all this was done in consultation with Yehuda, who is still at the age of 95 or 96, still active and still shows up at plenaries and still maintains an active interest in the work of IHRA. But it was kind of his brainchild and his idea. I remember sitting with Yehuda and talking about next steps, and we realized at that time that there had been a definition of anti-Semitism that had been floating around that grew out of efforts in the early 2000s to deal on an international level with what was happening with a wave of anti-Semitism in Europe. It was kind of grew out of meetings that were held on the level of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is 57 member states in Europe that deal with security, but also have a human rights dimension. And for example, there was a meeting in Berlin in 2004 that then Secretary of State Colin Powell, head of the US delegation, was that level. And out of all that work grew a working definition of anti-Semitism that was posted to the website of the European Union's human rights arm at that point. And then a number of years later, it never was adopted officially, it was posted. It got scrubbed with a number of other non-official documents from it. But it meant that because it had never been officially adopted and because it was scrubbed, there was nothing out there that was a reference to help people gauge what anti-Semitism really is or isn't. So in conversation with Yehuda, I came up with the idea of that being our next step, taking it to our committee, our work, get the experts behind it, then bring it up to the diplomatic level. It took another 3 years. And finally, under the Romanian chairmanship in 2016, that working definition of anti-Semitism was officially adopted. And it was an IHRA, it was meant for our use in IHRA. We didn't have greater grandiose visions at that point of it. It was important because, again, it gave everyone a common conception of what we were referring to. It was sort of multi-layered in some ways. It had a descriptive of anti-Semitism followed by a series of examples that could relate to it. One of the key things about it was we wanted it to encompass more than just the traditional, hard right-wing neo-Nazi extremist version of anti-Semitism, recognizing that there was now anti-Semitism that was aimed at Israel as a collective. There was anti-Semitism that was coming from the left still, extreme left and descendant of communist anti-Semitism. And we wanted something that would be flexible enough to encompass it. And in a sense, when we called it a working definition, it's non-legally binding, and it's a working definition. The idea of a working definition meant that it was not an academic definition. It was not, we didn't mean it as a work in progress to be amended constantly, but it was not an academic definition. It was meant for practical use for people who are in the field. And I'll give you one quick concrete example of why we realized it was necessary. In, I think, 2014, in an earlier Gaza war, there was a synagogue in Germany that, in a small German town, that had been rebuilt. It was destroyed in the late 30s, Kristallnacht, rebuilt after the war. It was firebombed. I could show slides of the Molotov cocktails, the bottles.
What town?
It was, I'm blanking on the town.
Okay.
But it was firebombed, and two men of Middle Eastern descent were arrested and confessed to it. And two German courts, one German court and then an appeals court, all ruled that that was just a political protest against Israeli action. It was not a hate crime. It was not, anything like that. And the idea that you could violently assault and commit an act of arson with people in the building and not call that a hate crime showed how difficult it was to target or pin something as being anti-Semitic in this political climate. And to their credit, by the way, that was one of the motivating things for the country of Germany to begin getting involved in the definition and putting it forward and doing things later on to it. So that examples kind of crystallized things, and we realized we wanted something that would encompass that. So, as I said, under the Romanian chairmanship, it was adopted in 2016, and then, much to our surprise, it started getting traction outside of IHRA. The UK was the first country to adopt it independently, followed by Israel and a number of other countries. And to date, it's been adopted by 35 countries on a formal basis,
Wow.
27 American states, meaning more than half of the US, universities. The UN has referred to, the UN actually last January in their resolution on Holocaust denial, condemning Holocaust denial, actually quoted our Holocaust denial definition. That's the basis of the UN resolution on Holocaust denial. The Organization of American States adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, produced a handbook on it. The EU has produced a handbook on it and how to use it. So it's got this immense traction. The world's largest group of imams, the Church of England, football, soccer teams. Lufthansa really had an embarrassing instance recently where it turned out they profiled a number of Hasidic Jews. As part of their training and reaction to it, they announced, I think last week, that they're officially adopting it and using it as part of their training program now. So it's really, it clearly met a need and has transcended IHRA and has become perhaps the single most important step in fighting anti-Semitism in decades. So that was a much longer answer than I think that you anticipated, but I just kind of wanted to give a picture of it.
I think it was a very good answer for our audience, really. Excellent.
Oh, great.
So the IHRA definition, working definition of anti-Semitism is, you hear it all the time. It's the most used definition of anti-Semitism these days, I think. Can you give some examples, Mark, as explained by the definition as to what is anti-Semitic as opposed to legitimate criticism of Israel?
So if I go into the description of the definition itself, it begins with a short description of, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gives that description and highlights that in sort of a boxed area because we wanted to highlight that. Immediately after that, however, is a short paragraph that explains how manifestations of anti-Semitism regarding the state of Israel it can include, and a sort of terse description of as a Jewish collective. In other words, that Israel represents Jews worldwide, and all Jews are thus legitimate targets if you oppose Israel. But then we immediately state that criticism of Israel, similar to criticism of every democratic state, is legitimate and is not anti-Semitic. So to give a concrete example, if you, even in some controversial issue, if you say that you oppose Israeli policy or action on something vis-a-vis the Palestinians, that's not anti-Semitic per se. I mean, how you couch it may be, but if you say you oppose it and it's wrong and so on, and you're morally opposed to it, politically opposed to it, I may disagree with you, but I have no problem with you saying it. If you say, however, that Israel is out to commit genocide and is trying to commit genocide, then you've taken it to a different level. If you say that Israel is a racist country that has no right to exist, unless you're saying that no nation states should exist, you've taken it to a different level. It's that double standard that is one of the qualifiers for where things are anti-Semitic. We also make the point that context matters, that how you say things and the circumstances in which you say things matter as well. And I think one of the strengths of our definition is that it's not a rigid checkbox like that. It's really a nuance that it leaves opening for people to recognize that situations can change. And as I said, if you have someone who supposedly, let's say a number of years ago, Israel built a separation wall to protect itself from a series of bombings and so on. If you have someone who says that I oppose that wall and it's immoral, it's wrong, etc., well, there are two ways of looking at it. If that person opposes that wall only, but doesn't oppose the wall that Saudi Arabia built, or doesn't oppose the wall between Pakistan and India in some ways, or doesn't oppose any of the 20 or other separation walls that are built by countries. And listen, we have a wall that was a big item of contention in the United States down on our Mexican border as well. If you oppose only one wall and one issue, that raises your motives into question. If you can say legitimately, I oppose all walls between countries, and there shouldn't be any, well, I may disagree with you and say that, this wall has protected people and served its purpose, etc., but I will not impugn you as being anti-Semitic because you're consistent, and it's a position that I respect, even if I might disagree with it. So that's some of the nuance and some of the context built into it as well. We do include examples, a series of 11 examples in it. For example, accusing Jews of around the world of being representative, let's say, of the state of Israel. For example, how that would play out was a number of years ago, 2 years ago, when there were all those protests in the United States about what was happening again in Gaza. There were restaurants in Los Angeles and New York where people were accosted and they were not asked, did they support the war? Did they support, Bibi Netanyahu? Did they vote for Labor, Likud, or, whatever? They were simply asked if they were Jewish by the extreme pro-Palestinian side. That, to me, is a clear example of, even if they're sort of politically motivated, but it descended into flat-out anti-Semitism, because the question was not, what do you think, but who are you?
Right.
And that is a bias.
Yeah.
So we try to encompass that. We try to include using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, such as claims of Jews Jews killing Jesus, or blood libel, targeting Israel, associated with Israel, the double standard of accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel than to their own country. But at the same time, we try to include traditional anti-Semitism as well. The examples are just a series of examples. They're not limited. Anti-Semitism is not limited to the 11 examples that we have. And there are others that we could add, and some may be less relevant as time goes by. But they're illustrative examples meant to help clarify.
And as you said, Mark, this working definition is used a lot, but it's not legally binding, but people can use it to define for themselves where
Right.
they draw the line of what is anti-Semitic and what is not.
So I
And,
think
and they can explain others.
very practical about that. In his last year in office, President Trump signed an executive order about anti-Semitism based on the IHRA definition. But that executive order did not, for example, people mischaracterized it as saying that the U.S. government is doing this and it's requiring a crackdown on people criticizing Israel and so on and so forth. No, the executive order was very specific and was very pointed. It applied only to the Department of Education, and it applied only to certain circumstances where there was an allegation or a claim of bias against Jewish students, or motivated by anti-Semitism on a college campus. And it was meant to help clarify whether that was an example of anti-Semitism, in which case it falls under certainly protected categories, or whether it did not reach that level and had to be treated as a less, let's say, severe offense. So it's a perfect example of, it's not legally binding. It's used for clarification, for education, for sorting out, for training purposes. Of course, by the way, any country that decides to apply it, every democratic country has the right to decide how they want to apply it or not. When we said non-legally binding, it was coming out of IHRA. We don't have the right or the authority to impose anything from IHRA in a legal codification, in a legal sense of it. So we had no pretensions and made no claims for that. And I'm very happy to keep it in the sense of where it is as sort of advisory, practical matter. I'm not looking to enter the free speech wars. I'm a pretty big proponent of freedom of speech. I think we have enough canceling going on all sides today, and we need to be able to critique and learn, and that's where the definition comes in. And it was, by the way, it was adopted by the State Department as well a number of years ago, and it's posted on the State Department website.
And I just want to say, before I ask the next question, it's the link to the definition with the examples is posted at the very top of our YouTube website, the banner, literally right there.
Right.
So those of you, when you come, who listen to our podcast, can check the definition anytime. But now my question is, what is the most important lesson that we can learn from the Remembrance of the Holocaust for speaking up against anti-Semitism today?
I think there are a couple of elements involved here. First of all, remembrance of the Holocaust per se by itself is not an antidote to anti-Semitism. There are people who use the Holocaust for all sorts of purposes, ranging from political purposes, ranging from that support extremist conspiracy theories. I have no truck with those who participate in anti-vaccination campaigns and use yellow stars, or claims that we were turning into that a public health measure was similar to Nazi Germany. Those are extreme conspiracy theories that certainly draw on anti-Semitic motifs, and I reject them totally. There are members of the U.S. Congress who have used Holocaust imagery in ways that are offensive and inappropriate, for example. And I think that we have to be careful about, saying that that the Holocaust is the answer or antidote to teaching about it to anti-Semitism. I think that we can say, though, that it is a necessary component, I think, of recognizing and part of where our society today came from, in both positive and negative way. The negative way clearly being it's the classic example, maybe the paradigmatic example. I think again that's Yehuda Bauer's word, but not only anti-Semitism but industrial, technological genocide in the 20th century in recent memory. And it also is the foundation in many ways of our world. The institutions of liberal democracy, whether they've had failures or not, I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole different discussion. But places like the UN or the EU or things like that, institutions like that, organizations like that, and concepts like genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity all grew out of the revulsion of the Holocaust and the reaction to the human cost of World War II. So there's an element there we need to understand it's part of the foundation of our world, of our democracy, a liberal democracy. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if I can go back to January 6th, the insurrection storming of the Capitol, I think I was taken very strongly by Speaker Nancy Pelosi's reaction afterwards. There was so much, and again, she's a veteran politician, and I'm not taking position on her positions or anything like that, but she's a veteran politician, as tough as they come. You don't get to that position, especially as a woman, if you're not strong and not tough. And she focused on I can't say gentleman, on the individual wearing the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. And I wondered, with all the other weird characters out there with the hats and the horns and everything else, why did she focus on that person and that individual? And I think she honed in on something, kind of what I just mentioned, that the attempt to, and this is where Holocaust distortion comes back into the picture, the attempt to distort and minimize the Holocaust means an attempt in its own way, kind of obliquely, but is an attempt to undermine those institutions that our society today is built on. As I said, the concepts of human rights and rejection of discrimination and bias based on religion and race and so on. The international organizations that undergird and are supposed to try to create a framework of lessening conflict, if not diminishing or getting rid of it totally. If you get rid of the Holocaust or make it so little, so unimportant that it doesn't matter anymore, you take away the validation for some of these institutions, and that's what some people are trying to accomplish. So I think that element is very strong. That's a sort of a larger general macro picture. In the micro part of it, anti-Semitism has not only not gone away, it's increased. We know that. Dara Horn is a wonderful author, did a very strong book. I forget the exact title, but the thrust of it is that people are very comfortable commemorating dead Jews.
Yes.
It's live Jews that they have the issue with. The Holocaust is a look backward, even though there are the lessons that I mentioned need to be applied for today. But a lot of people, individuals, institutions, countries are more comfortable with commemorating the dead Jews who can't speak up and don't pose a problem today. I am interested in the Holocaust as what happened in the past, but also its impact today, and what the lessons are for protecting live Jews. In that case, I think that one of the things we have to realize is that we need to speak up. We need to be assertive, not assertive against others. We're not asserting superiority or anything like that, but assertive in saying that we deserve the same rights as anybody else. We are a minority. We're a tiny minority. I know our success rate has been unparalleled in the United States. I know our history in the United States is unparalleled as well. And I thank God that my ancestors left Europe and came here when they came here.
Exactly.
It's just every day I do that.
So does my husband every day.
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't mean that there's not a history of anti-Semitism in the U.S. There is. And we see, it coming out today in many ways as well. But we're not actors in anyone else's political drama. We are, we have our own role to play in history. We define ourselves. At the same time, we don't exist in a vacuum. And we need allies. We need strong allies. I was just in Europe, and I guess we'll get to that in a minute or so. And through my work in IHRA, where the majority of people are not Jewish, I've met people who are so committed to this work, who have devoted themselves professionally in places, far out places, Slovenia and Serbia, and places like we don't even think about generally, and yet devote themselves to keeping the memory alive and making sure that the lessons are learned today. And that's really encouraging, that we have those kind of allies, and we need to, I think, recognize their importance and appreciate them as well.
Uh, I'm watching the clock, so I just need you to only because I'm now a new member of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. That's where I met you in person in June at the conference. Just could you tell us briefly how that one organization, which has global members, works to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive?
AHO plays a unique and indispensable role. It is the network of Holocaust organizations internationally. I can't remember how many members we have, 350, 500, something like that. And it's grown immensely since it began. But the role of AHO is to provide a place where people can, in the field, can stay in touch, can learn from each other, can support each other. This is not an easy field to work in the sense of that there is controversy involved with it. It touches on difficult historical issues in many places. In the United States, we have a vast network of support. In other countries and other regions and other places, we don't necessarily have that. There are people who are isolated, who I just talked about, the people who are devoting themselves to this work, but don't have a support system, don't have the network. AHO provides that. It has a listserv for members. It shares information. It shares updates. It provides a place where people can come together physically, where people can learn from each other. It provides a place where institutions that are small, the modern version of the one-room schoolroom of lore, can receive support from larger institutions like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or Yad Vashem or places like that. It provides a voice for these people. And I know from experience that I've consulted with members of Congress as they produced legislation or worked on legislation. AHO's had a voice in those conversations. So it really plays an indispensable role for an organization whose, I think, importance is growing every year. And I'm very grateful to have played a part in it.
And thank you for the part that you play, Evelyn.
Finally, Mark, let's discuss the work you do as Chief Operating Officer for the World Jewish Restitution Organization. Could you tell us about the organization's mission?
Well, the WJRO is actually a relatively new organization. It's kind of linked a little bit together with the Claims Conference. So I'll begin with the Claims Conference, which grew out of the late 1940s, early 1950s negotiations with Germany and Austria, headed by survivors such as Saul Kagan and Roman Kent and that generation of survivors. But Claims, which was just in the news with the recent agreement that they signed, I think just a couple of days ago, with Germany, renewing the 70-year relationship and continuing it and moving it forward. Claims really deals only with Germany and Austria, which is a massive job in itself because, as we all know, the Holocaust originated with Germany, and the Austrians, despite their early attempts, were willing partners in a national sense. WJRO grew out of the lifting of the Iron Curtain in the mid-1990s, where all these countries that had been inaccessible in terms of Holocaust issues. IHRA, by the way, the same thing. IHRA, in some ways, dealt with the educational and historical issues for some of these countries in its earliest iteration, beginning in 1998 and 2000. But WJRO began in 1995 and is a consortium of 14 different Jewish organizations, representing internationally the voice of survivors to deal with the issues regarding restitution and Holocaust memory in the approximately 17 countries that are not Germany and Austria and were now accessible after the lifting of the Iron Curtain. So we don't deal with individual cases. We try to create legal agreements and frameworks where restitution can take place on communal property, on private property, depending on the circumstances. We deal with restoration and preservation of Jewish heritage sites, such as cemeteries that were abandoned, or synagogues that were, abandoned and no longer have anyone to support them. We work with the local Jewish communities as well. We are partners in foundations in a number of these countries that carry the work on. So there's a voice and participation of the local Jewish community. And it's an ongoing effort to achieve justice before it's too late. I was just in Europe this week. Coincidentally, at the same time as the claims conference meetings in Berlin were going on, I was in Strasbourg on Wednesday, where we had a conference on Holocaust restitution at the European Parliament. And just to give you an example of the kind of people that we're talking about that I mentioned earlier, who are allies in this force, the member of the European Parliament who sponsored it from Luxembourg, a man named Charles Gorens, turned out, and I did not know this until we sat down Wednesday morning and we're just chatting, that he had headed the Luxembourg delegation to the Stockholm Forum in 2000, which created IHRA. So he's been involved in this work, and clearly he was involved a little bit before that, let's say for the mid or late 1990s, to head the delegation there. He has been involved in this work as a member, a politician from Luxembourg for over 25 years. He's not Jewish, and he's doing it because it matters and he cares. And he's still doing it. So he produced and tabled and introduced a resolution in the European Parliament that we expect them to take up and vote on in early October, that endorses the European Union's Parliament's support of the idea of restitution for all its member countries, and calls on them to support. There's an large-scale international conference taking place in Prague on November 3rd, sponsored by the Czech government, which is a 10-year commemoration of an earlier conference called the Terrorism Conference and Terrorism Declaration, where 47 countries came together and signed the declaration, again, supported the idea of restitution, Holocaust education and memory, and so on. So it's 10 years on, and the Czechs are revisiting it. It's high level. They're inviting the level of foreign ministers and delegations. I'll actually be one of the speakers at the conference. And it's an attempt to move it forward and have each country express commitments, again, not necessarily legally, but morally or politically binding commitments on what they will do in the future, in the next few years, on this issue to move it forward. So these are the things that WJRO is involved with that are, I guess we could say we're a sister of the Claims Conference, but have a unique role to play distinct from the Claims Conference.
Thank you for explaining that. We're at the end of our time, except I promised you anything really important that you want to add that we didn't give you a chance to say.
Yes, and this is going to be really a thank you to you guys, because I can't tell you how encouraging it is to find people like yourselves who take up an issue and are not, involved on the high professional level or high institutional level with, the either governments or academic work on it, or institutional organizational work, but are basically people who have had an interest and a commitment. And that is really, I think, what we draw support on a political level, on a strategic level, and an emotional and moral level, is the fact that the people are mobilizing on a very I'll say grassroots level, in a way, to express their interest and concern and care about it and commitment to it. And your podcast is a reflection of that. And I think it's hugely important. It sets an example and models what individuals can do, that, you don't have to sit around waiting for something to come from the top down. And I think the more people listen to your podcast, the more people follow your path, your footsteps, the better off our world will be. So I thank you for your commitment and passion on
That's
this.
very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Mark. Thank you for our listeners. For anyone who has not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, I highly recommend it. And you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. There's more information about my free nonfiction Holocaust play at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every podcast, we say, as long as you don't put yourself in physical harm, Speak up whenever you can against anti-Semitism and all hate.